A prophet once said that a voice would cry out from the mountain and the entire world would never be the same. On that fateful day in Galilee, as Jesus ascended the slope, the heavens themselves held their breath. What was about to be spoken would fulfill ancient prophecies, yet shatter every expectation. The crowds didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the moment when heaven's government would be declared on earth. In Matthew 5, something supernatural occurs. Words are spoken that will judge nations, topple kingdoms, and reveal the secrets of men's hearts for millennia to come. The Beatitudes aren't just blessings, they're prophetic declarations of a coming reality. When Jesus said the meek shall inherit the earth, he wasn't giving advice, he was announcing destiny. Every command about anger, lust, and enemy love carries the weight of divine prophecy. Here's the mystery. This chapter doesn't just tell us how to live, it predicts what kind of people will survive God's final judgment. It's a mirror showing us our future, a blueprint of the age to come. Why is Matthew 5 the most important? Because hidden in these verses is the prophetic key to understanding everything that comes after. The question is, can you see it? The story begins with a simple but powerful moment. Jesus saw the crowds gathering around him, and he made a deliberate choice. Matthew chapter 5 verse 1 tells us that when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. This wasn't random. This wasn't just finding a convenient spot to teach. Every Jewish person watching would have felt their hearts skip a beat because mountains meant something sacred in their history. Centuries before, Moses had climbed Mount Sinai to meet with God. The people trembled at the base of that mountain as thunder rolled and lightning flashed. The ground shook and smoke covered the peak. Moses went up alone into that terrifying display of God's power and came down carrying stone tablets, the law that would define Israel for generations. That mountain became the symbol of God's covenant with his people, the place where heaven touched earth and changed everything. Now here was Jesus climbing another mountain, and the echo of that ancient moment hung in the air. The parallel was impossible to miss. But there was something profoundly different this time. Moses went up to receive the law from God, acting as a mediator between the people and the divine. Jesus went up to explain what the law truly meant, speaking with his own authority. Moses came down with commandments written on stone, external rules to follow. Jesus would speak words that would be written on human hearts, internal transformation that changed people from the inside out. The mountain setting wasn't just a teaching platform, it was a declaration. Something as significant as Sinai was happening again, but this time the message would go even deeper. Moses brought the law. Jesus would reveal the heart behind the law. The old covenant was about obedience to commands. The new covenant would be about transformation of character, and everyone watching sensed that history was about to turn on its axis. As Jesus settled on the mountainside, people arranged themselves around him. Matthew 5:1 continues, noting that his disciples came to him. These were the men who had left everything to follow him. Fishermen who abandoned their nets, a tax collector who walked away from his booth, ordinary people who sensed they were part of something extraordinary. They pressed in close, eager to hear what their teacher would say. These weren't scholars or religious professionals. They were regular people with rough hands and simple lives who had recognized something special in this carpenter from Nazareth. But they weren't alone. Behind them, spreading across the hillside like a living tapestry, were the crowds. Word had spread throughout Galilee about this teacher who spoke with authority, who healed the sick with a touch, who welcomed sinners that religious leaders shunned. People had traveled from their villages, leaving their work and their homes, desperate to hear him speak. Some had walked for days, others had brought sick relatives hoping for healing. The mixture was incredible. Pharisees stood near prostitutes, wealthy merchants near beggars, Roman sympathizers near zealots who hated Rome. This audience mattered deeply. Jesus wasn't speaking in the temple to religious experts who could debate fine points of the law. He wasn't addressing the powerful in a palace where politics and privilege ruled. He was teaching ordinary people on an open hillside where anyone could listen. A shepherd could hear the same words as a scholar. A child had the same access as a community leader. The location itself was revolutionary. No walls to keep people out, no guards to check credentials, no social barriers to climb over. The hillside became a prophetic picture of the kingdom Jesus was announcing. In God's kingdom, the invitation was open to everyone. The message wasn't hidden behind locked doors or reserved for the elite. Heaven's wisdom was being delivered in the open air, where the poorest person had exactly the same opportunity to hear and respond as the richest. This was scandalous to the religious establishment, but it was the heart of what Jesus came to do. Then Jesus opened his mouth and began to teach them. The hillside grew quiet as people strained to hear. His first words in Matthew 5:3 must have startled everyone listening. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed, the poor. This made no sense according to everything they'd been taught. You could almost hear the confusion rippling through the crowd. In that culture, poverty was seen as a curse, a clear sign of God's disfavor. The religious teachers had made this very plain. If you were wealthy and successful, God was obviously blessing you. Your prosperity proved your righteousness. If you were poor and struggling, you must have sinned, or your ancestors sinned, or you simply lacked faith. Material blessing was the evidence of spiritual standing. The poor were ignored, dismissed, sometimes even blamed for their own condition. They were considered far from God's favor, and everyone accepted this as obvious truth. But Jesus flipped this thinking completely upside down with his very first statement. He wasn't talking about people who had no money in their pockets. He said, poor in spirit. This was something different, something deeper. These were people who recognized their spiritual bankruptcy, who knew they had absolutely nothing to offer God, who understood they were completely dependent on his mercy. They weren't proud of their religious achievements or convinced of their own goodness. They didn't come to God with a list of their accomplishments hoping to impress him. Instead, they came empty-handed. They admitted they needed everything from him. Like a beggar with an empty bowl, they acknowledged their poverty and asked for help. This was the opposite of the religious leaders who stood in the temple thanking God they weren't like other people, listing all the ways they kept the law perfectly. The poor in spirit had no such list. They had only need. And to these people, Jesus made an incredible promise. Not someday they might receive the kingdom if they worked hard enough, not eventually they could earn their way in. But right now, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Present tense. The kingdom belonged to them already, in that very moment. While the proud and self-sufficient were locked outside the gates, convinced they deserved entry, these spiritually poor people were walking straight into God's kingdom. The entry requirement wasn't achievement, but admission of need. The door opened not to the strong, but to those who knew they were weak. Jesus didn't pause to let that first statement sink in. He immediately moved to the second beatitude in Matthew 5:4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Again, this seemed completely backwards. How could mourning people be called blessed? Wasn't blessing supposed to mean happiness and joy and good times? Mourning was the opposite of all that. The people listening knew mourning intimately. It was woven into the fabric of their daily lives. They'd lost children to disease, parents to old age, friends to violence or accidents. Grief was a constant companion in a world without modern medicine, where life was fragile and death came quickly and often without warning. Infant mortality was high. Plagues swept through villages. Occupational accidents claimed lives regularly. Everyone in that crowd had mourned, and many were mourning still. Mourners were considered unfortunate, people to be pitied. They certainly weren't called blessed. When someone was in mourning, you felt sorry for them. You might bring them food or sit with them, but you didn't congratulate them or tell them how fortunate they were. Mourning meant loss, pain, sorrow, all the things people tried to avoid. But Jesus was talking about a specific kind of mourning. Yes, it included grief over loss and pain. He wasn't dismissing that real sorrow, but more deeply, more importantly, he meant mourning over sin. Their own sin first, but also the sin of the world around them. These were people who didn't excuse their failures or blame others for their mistakes. They didn't minimize their wrongdoing or rationalize it away. They felt genuine sorrow when they fell short, when they hurt others, when they failed to be who they should be. Their hearts broke over what broke God's heart. When they saw injustice, they grieved. When they recognized their own selfishness, they wept. When they looked at the brokenness of the world, the cruelty, the hatred, the suffering, they didn't just shrug and accept it as normal. They mourned. They felt the weight of it. They carried a godly sorrow that led them to change, to repentance, to desperate need for God's intervention. The religious people of that day didn't mourn their sin. They denied it or covered it with rituals and rule-keeping. They were confident in their righteousness, comfortable with their standing before God. But Jesus said, the people who truly grieve over their failures, who weep over their need for forgiveness, who feel the ache of separation from God that sin creates, these people will be comforted. Not might be comforted someday, will be comforted, certain and sure. God himself would console them. The comfort Jesus promised wasn't just feeling better emotionally or having a friend pat your shoulder. It was the deep, soul-level peace of knowing your sins are completely forgiven, that God has wiped away your guilt entirely, that you can start absolutely fresh with a clean slate. Those who mourn their sin would find the ultimate comfort in God's embrace, in his promise that their sins are remembered no more, cast as far as the east is from the west. The third beatitude came next, and it was perhaps the most shocking of all. Matthew 5:5 records Jesus saying, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." In a world ruled by Roman military might, where the strong dominated the weak and power came through force and violence, this statement sounded absolutely absurd. It contradicted everything they saw around them every single day. Meekness was despised throughout the Roman Empire. It was seen as weakness, as the quality of people who couldn't fight back, who got trampled by others, who were powerless victims. Strong men weren't meek. Soldiers weren't meek. Rulers certainly weren't meek. The world belonged to the bold, the aggressive, the ones who took what they wanted by force. Conquerors inherited the earth by marching their armies across it, subjugating populations, seizing territory. The meek inherited nothing but poverty, oppression, and early graves. Roman boots marched through every town in Judea, a constant reminder of who really ruled. Might made right. Force established order. The sword decided who owned what. This was reality, visible and undeniable. And here was Jesus saying the meek would inherit the earth. It seemed like fantasy, like wishful thinking from someone who didn't understand how the world actually worked. But Jesus defined meekness very differently than the world did. Meekness wasn't weakness at all. It was strength under control. It was power that chose not to dominate. It was choosing gentleness when you could choose violence, choosing humility instead of arrogance, choosing to trust God's justice instead of grabbing power for yourself. Meek people didn't demand their rights or push others down to climb up. They didn't retaliate when wronged or seek revenge when hurt. Think of a powerful horse, strong enough to carry a knight into battle, fast enough to outrun danger. That horse has tremendous strength, but when properly trained, it submits to the rider's control. That's meekness. Great strength yielded to a higher authority. Meek people had power, but chose not to abuse it. They had rights, but chose not to demand them. They had the ability to fight back, but chose peace instead. And these people Jesus declared with absolute certainty, would inherit the earth. Not through conquest or force, but through God's promise and plan. The land that belonged temporarily to the violent would ultimately be given permanently to the gentle. The kingdom that the proud tried to seize by force would be handed freely to the humble. The earth that tyrants fought over would finally rest in the hands of those who never fought for it at all. This was a complete reversal of worldly wisdom, but it was God's way from the beginning. The meek would outlast all the tyrants. Empires built on violence would crumble to dust, but God's promise to the gentle would stand forever. In the end, when all the fighting was done and all the kingdoms had fallen, the meek would still be standing, and the earth would be theirs. Jesus continued with the fourth beatitude in Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now he was talking about desire, not casual interest, but deep, desperate, all-consuming desire like hunger and thirst. Everyone listening knew what real hunger felt like. In that agricultural society where most people lived close to subsistence level, poor harvests meant empty bellies. A drought could mean starvation. Hunger wasn't an inconvenience you felt before dinner. It was a painful, constant ache that made it hard to think about anything else. Thirst in that desert climate was even more serious and immediate. You could survive weeks without food, but only days without water. In the heat, dehydration could kill you quickly. When you're truly hungry or desperately thirsty, nothing else matters. You can't focus on your work, enjoy a conversation, or think about tomorrow. All you can think about is getting food or water. It's an all-consuming, desperate need. Jesus said some people feel exactly that way about righteousness. They crave right living the way a starving person craves bread. They long to see justice done the way someone dying of thirst longs for water. They ache for purity the way a hungry child aches for food. These aren't people who are casually interested in being relatively good people or who hope to be slightly better than average. They're desperate for it. They can't be satisfied with a little bit of righteousness or a small measure of justice. They hunger to see wrongs made right in the world. When they see injustice, the powerful oppressing the weak, the rich exploiting the poor, the innocent suffering, it creates a deep ache in them. They thirst for God's justice to prevail. They long to see His kingdom come and His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And in their own lives, they hunger for personal righteousness. They want to live purely, to reflect God's character, to be holy as He is holy. When they fail, when they sin, when they fall short, it's not a small disappointment, it's anguish. Most people in Jesus' day didn't hunger for righteousness like this. The religious leaders were satisfied with their rule-keeping, confident they'd checked all the boxes. The common people were focused on survival, getting enough food, paying their taxes, making it through another day under Roman occupation. The wealthy were comfortable with their privilege and didn't want anything to change. But Jesus said those who truly hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are never satisfied with how things are, who always want more of God's way, who can't rest until righteousness prevails, these people will be filled. God will satisfy that hunger completely. He will quench that thirst fully, not just partially, not just temporarily, but thoroughly and permanently. They will be filled. The Greek word suggests being completely satisfied, filled to the brim, having every bit of that hunger met. Those who desperately want righteousness will receive it in abundance, pressed down and overflowing. The fifth beatitude shifted focus slightly. Matthew 5:7 records Jesus saying, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." This was about how we treat other people, and it came with both a beautiful promise and a sobering warning wrapped together. Mercy meant showing compassion to people who didn't deserve it, forgiving those who wronged you, helping those who couldn't pay you back, giving second chances to those who failed you. In a culture built on revenge and strict payback, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, mercy was revolutionary and rare. If someone hurt you, justice meant hurting them back equally. The law allowed it, Society expected it, and it felt perfectly right and fair. Someone steals from you, take back what they stole and make them pay extra. Someone insults you, insult them back twice as hard. Someone injures you, make sure they suffer the same injury. This system seemed to make sense. It felt like justice. It maintained social order by ensuring consequences for wrongs. But it also created endless cycles of revenge, where every act of retaliation justified another one, and conflicts that started small escalated into blood feuds that lasted generations. Everyone kept careful score of who owed what to whom. But Jesus said the blessed people were those who chose mercy instead of revenge. They didn't demand their rights or insist on getting even. When someone owed them money and couldn't pay, they forgave the debt entirely. When someone wronged them, they responded with unexpected kindness instead of expected revenge. They looked at failures and sinners with compassion instead of contempt. They gave grace when justice would have given punishment. Why would they do this? It seemed foolish, like letting people take advantage of you. But merciful people understood something crucial. They needed mercy themselves. They knew their own failures intimately, their own need for forgiveness desperately. They recognized that if God gave them what they deserved, they would be in serious trouble. So they extended to others what they hoped to receive from God. They treated people's failures the way they wanted God to treat their own, and Jesus promised that merciful people would be shown mercy. This wasn't earning God's forgiveness through good behavior. That would make mercy into a transaction, no longer mercy at all. Rather, merciful hearts are hearts that understand grace at a deep level. They've received mercy, and it's changed them, made them generous with others, and God continues to pour out mercy on those who show mercy to others, creating a beautiful cycle. You receive mercy from God, which transforms your heart. That transformed heart extends mercy to others. God sees this and pours out even more mercy on you. The flip side was equally true, though Jesus didn't state it explicitly here. Those who refuse to show mercy, who demand their rights and insist on revenge, who hold grudges and won't forgive, they reveal hearts that haven't truly understood mercy themselves, and they will find God's mercy harder to access. Not because God is petty, but because unmerciful hearts are closed hearts, unable to receive the very thing they refuse to give. Jesus concluded this first section with the sixth beatitude in Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. This was the deepest statement yet, reaching past all external actions and behaviors straight into the inner world of motives and desires that only God could see. The religious system of that day focused obsessively on external purity. Wash your hands the right way before eating. Avoid certain foods that were declared unclean. Stay away from certain people who might contaminate you. Follow the correct rituals for cleansing if you touched something impure. Keep the Sabbath with elaborate rules about what you could and couldn't do. The Pharisees had developed hundreds of detailed regulations about maintaining ceremonial purity. If you kept all the outward rules perfectly, you were considered pure and righteous and acceptable to God. But your heart could be full of hatred, seething with greed, poisoned with pride, and nobody cared as long as you looked clean on the outside. You could wash your hands while plotting to cheat your neighbor. You could avoid unclean foods while nurturing unclean thoughts. You could keep every Sabbath regulation while your heart was far from God. The system measured what could be seen and ignored what couldn't. Jesus cut through all of that religious pretense with a single phrase. He talked about purity of heart, the inner person that nobody else can see, the hidden motives behind your actions, the secret thoughts you'd never say out loud. A pure heart isn't divided, trying to serve God and self at the same time. It isn't contaminated with mixed motives, doing good things for selfish reasons, or serving God to gain something for yourself. A pure heart loves God simply and completely, follows him without ulterior motives, desires what he desires without constantly calculating personal benefit. This kind of purity was rare because it required brutal honesty with yourself. You couldn't fake it or perform it for an audience. You couldn't put on a show of purity for others while harboring impure thoughts inside. You had to actually be pure inside, in the secret place where only God could see. You had to want God himself more than you wanted anything else, more than approval from others, more than personal comfort, more than success or security. You had to love righteousness for its own sake, not for what it could get you. And to people with this kind of heart, Jesus made the ultimate promise: they will see God, not just in heaven someday after they die, though that was certainly included, but even now, even in this life, they would see God at work. Pure hearts have clear vision, like clean windows that let light pour through. They see God working in circumstances where others see only random chance. They recognize his hand in events where others see only coincidence. They perceive his presence in moments where others feel only emptiness. Impure hearts are like dirty windows or clouded mirrors. Everything is obscured, distorted. When your heart is divided between God and other loves, when your motives are mixed, when you're serving God with one hand and yourself with the other, your spiritual vision becomes blurry. You can't see clearly what God is doing. But purity of heart opens your eyes to see the God who is always there, always working, always present. That clear vision, that ability to see and know God, that's the blessing Jesus promised to the pure in heart. Jesus continued with the seventh beatitude in Matthew 5:9, saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." This wasn't about people who simply liked peace or avoided conflict whenever possible. It was about those who actively worked to create peace where there was none, who stepped into broken situations and brought healing. The world Jesus spoke into was full of conflict at every level. Jews hated Romans who occupied their land with military force. Different Jewish groups despised each other. Pharisees looked down on tax collectors as traitors. Zealots plotted violence against Roman sympathizers. The religious elite scorned common people as ignorant and unclean. Families were divided by grudges that went back years, sometimes generations. Neighbors nursed resentments over property disputes, unpaid debts, or old insults. Violence simmered just below the surface of daily life, sometimes erupting into riots and bloodshed that brought brutal Roman retaliation. Into this fractured, hostile world, Jesus called for peacemakers. These were people who stepped into conflicts and worked actively to bring reconciliation. When two people were fighting, peacemakers didn't take sides or gossip or make things worse. They built bridges between enemies. When communities were divided, they brought people together around common ground. When hatred threatened to explode into violence, they spoke words that calmed and healed. When relationships broke down, they worked to restore them. This required enormous courage because peacemakers often got attacked from both sides. People in conflict wanted allies who would validate their anger, not mediators who asked them to forgive. It required wisdom to know what to say and when to stay silent. It required patience because reconciliation rarely happened quickly. Most of all, it required love, caring more about peace than about being right, valuing relationships more than winning arguments. And Jesus gave them an incredible identity. They wouldn't just be called blessed or good people or helpful citizens. They would be called children of God. This was deeply personal and profound. God himself is the ultimate peacemaker. He made peace between himself and humanity through Jesus, reconciling the world to himself. When people make peace, they're acting like their Father, doing his work in the world, reflecting his character to everyone watching. They prove their family resemblance. Every act of peacemaking declared whose children they were and what family they belonged to. The eighth and final beatitude came in Matthew 5:10. "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Jesus then expanded on this thought in verses 11 and 12. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. This must have confused and disturbed the crowd. Persecution was blessing. Being insulted and lied about was something to rejoice over. Everything in them wanted to avoid suffering, not celebrate it. Yet Jesus was absolutely clear. When you face persecution specifically because of righteousness, because you follow him, because you stand for what's right, you're blessed. Notice the reason for persecution mattered enormously. Jesus wasn't calling all suffering blessed or suggesting people should seek out pain. If you did something wrong and got punished, that wasn't blessing, that was consequences, justice, reaping what you sowed. But when you lived righteously and people attacked you for it, when you followed Jesus and society turned against you, when you stood for truth and lies were spread about you, that persecution was actually evidence that you belonged to God's kingdom. It was proof you were on the right side. The world system fundamentally opposed God's kingdom and his ways. Light and darkness couldn't coexist peacefully. When you truly lived according to kingdom values, you became a threat to people who were comfortable with darkness. Your light exposed their darkness and made them uncomfortable. Your righteousness made their sin visible by contrast. Your peace challenged their conflict. Your mercy revealed their hardness. Your purity showed up their corruption. So they attacked because your very existence was a rebuke to their way of life. They insulted you, calling you narrow-minded, judgmental, weak, foolish. They persecuted you, excluding you socially, damaging you economically, sometimes attacking you physically. They lied about you, spreading false accusations to destroy your reputation, attributing evil motives to good actions, twisting your words to make you look bad. All of this hurt. It was real suffering, real pain, real loss. But Jesus said this persecution proved you were on the right path. The prophets before had faced exactly the same treatment. Every person who truly spoke for God had been opposed, rejected, often killed by the very people they were sent to help. Isaiah was sawed in half, according to tradition. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern and left to die. John the Baptist would soon be beheaded. Now Jesus' followers would join that noble lineage of those who suffered for righteousness. And their reward in heaven would be great, not as payment they earned through suffering, but as inheritance they were guaranteed as God's children. The kingdom belonged to them already, right now in the present tense, even as they suffered. Persecution didn't disqualify them from blessing. It confirmed their blessing, proved their citizenship, validated their identity as kingdom people. After completing the Beatitudes, Jesus shifted to explaining what his followers actually were in the world and what function they served. In Matthew 5:13, he declared with absolute certainty, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." Salt was incredibly valuable in that culture, essential for daily life. It preserved food in a world without refrigeration. Meat would rot in hours under the hot sun. Fish would spoil almost immediately. But salt kept food edible for months, even years. Salt also brought out flavor, transforming bland food into something enjoyable. It was used in sacrifices, in purification rituals, in covenant-making ceremonies. It was so important that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt. That's where we get the phrase, "worth his salt." Everyone understood its worth and necessity. Jesus looked at his disciples, these fishermen and tax collectors and ordinary people, and said, "You are salt." Not you should try to be salt someday. Not you might become salt if you work hard enough. You are salt right now, in the present. His followers had a preserving influence on the world around them. Just like salt stopped meat from rotting and decay from spreading, their presence stopped society from completely corrupting itself. Their righteousness, their mercy, their peacemaking, their pure hearts, all of this pushed back against moral decay and spiritual rot. Without salt, food spoiled. Without Jesus' followers, society would decay into complete darkness. Their very presence made a difference, even when they didn't realize it. They were preserving influences in their families, their workplaces, their communities. Where they lived and walked and spoke, corruption slowed. They weren't responsible for saving the whole world by themselves, but they were salt that made their corner of it better. They also brought flavor to life, making it taste different and better. A world without Jesus' followers would be bland, meaningless, hopeless, without joy or purpose. But they carried something the world didn't have. They had joy even in suffering, peace even in chaos, love even toward enemies, hope even in death. This made life taste different for people around them. Watching them, others saw something worth having, something that made existence more than just survival. But Jesus gave a sobering warning with this identity. Salt could lose its effectiveness and become useless. In that region, salt came from the Dead Sea and often mixed with other minerals and impurities. Over time, especially if exposed to moisture, the actual sodium chloride could dissolve away, leaving behind the other minerals. What remained looked like salt, white and granular, but it had no saltiness. It couldn't preserve food or add flavor. It was completely useless for its intended purpose. What could you do with such false salt? Nothing except throw it out on the paths and roads where people walked. It would be trampled underfoot, ground into the dirt, ignored and despised. In the same way, Jesus warned, if his followers lost their distinctiveness, if they acted just like everyone else in the world, compromised their values to fit in, blended into the culture around them, stopped living according to kingdom principles, they became useless for his purposes. They might still look like his followers on the outside, attend the right meetings, say the right words, but have no real impact. The world would trample them underfoot, ignore them, dismiss them as irrelevant and hypocritical. Jesus immediately followed with another metaphor in Matthew 5:14-16, expanding his description of who his followers were. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Again, notice Jesus didn't say you should try to be light or you need to become light. He said you are light, present tense, already true. Darkness covered the world, spiritual darkness of not knowing God, moral darkness of sin and evil, the darkness of hopelessness and death. Into that pervasive darkness, Jesus' followers shined. They brought truth where there was deception, hope where there was despair, love where there was hatred, life where there was death. Their very presence and way of living illuminated what was hidden in shadow. Jesus used two vivid pictures to make his point absolutely clear. First, imagine a city built on a hillside at night. In that ancient world without electric lights, when darkness fell, it was absolutely black. But when a town sat on a hill, every lamp burning in every house combined to create a glow visible for miles around. Travelers walking in the dark valley below could look up, see that light, and find their way to safety. The city couldn't hide its light even if it wanted to. The geographical location made concealment impossible. That elevated position meant visibility. Second, think about a lamp inside a house. You didn't light an oil lamp and then immediately cover it with a clay bowl or basket, making it useless. That would be absurd, defeating the whole purpose of lighting it. You put the lamp on a lampstand, an elevated holder, so it could fulfill its purpose, pushing back darkness and helping everyone in the house see where they were going. The lamp's whole reason for existing was to give light. Covering it made no sense. Jesus' followers were like both that city and that lamp. They couldn't hide their identity even if they tried. Living according to kingdom values made them visible and distinct. A life of genuine love, real forgiveness, honest speech, sexual purity, sacrificial generosity. All of this stood out in a dark world. People noticed, and they shouldn't try to hide it anyway, or downplay their faith or blend in completely. Their purpose was to shine, to let their good deeds be clearly visible so that people would see and respond. But notice the goal. The light wasn't meant to draw attention to themselves, to make them look good, or to earn praise for how righteous they were. The purpose of their visible good deeds was that others would glorify their Father in heaven. When people saw their love, their integrity, their generosity, their peace, the proper response wasn't, "Wow, you're amazing," but "Wow, your God is amazing." The light pointed beyond itself to the source of light. Their transformed lives testified to the transforming power of God. Having established who his followers were, salt and light, Jesus made a crucial statement about his own mission and his relationship to Scripture in Matthew 5:17-18. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Some people in the crowd were clearly worried and confused. Jesus was saying things that sounded radical and new. He was interpreting the law in ways the religious teachers never had, going deeper than the traditional understandings. He was claiming authority that seemed to put him on the same level as Moses. Was he throwing out the Old Testament? Was he saying Moses and the prophets got it wrong? Was he starting a completely new religion that rejected Israel's scriptures? Jesus addressed these concerns head-on with absolute clarity. He hadn't come to abolish or destroy the law and the prophets, the entire Hebrew scriptures, everything written from Genesis through Malachi. He came to fulfill them, to complete them, to bring them to their intended goal and full meaning. Everything written before was pointing forward. Now, the reality had arrived. Think of the relationship between a seed and a fully grown tree. The tree doesn't abolish the seed or prove the seed was wrong. The tree fulfills the seed, showing what the seed was always meant to become. The seed contained the blueprint for the tree. In the same way, the law and prophets were always pointing forward to Jesus. Every sacrifice in the temple anticipated his ultimate sacrifice. Every command revealed aspects of the character he would perfectly embody. Every prophecy spoke of his coming and his kingdom. He was the fulfillment, the completion, the full expression of everything the Old Testament was moving toward. Jesus emphasized with the strongest possible language, "Truly I tell you, that not even the smallest detail of the law would disappear or lose significance." The smallest letter referred to the Hebrew letter Yod, which looked like a tiny apostrophe, barely more than a small mark on the page. The least stroke of a pen meant the small decorative hooks and extensions that distinguished one Hebrew letter from another. Even these minute details mattered to God and would remain relevant until everything was accomplished, until God's entire redemptive plan reached its completion. The law wasn't being discarded as obsolete or irrelevant. It was being fulfilled in Jesus and would continue to have meaning and significance as understood through him. He was the key that unlocked its full meaning, the lens through which it should now be read. Jesus then made a shocking and disturbing statement in Matthew 5:20, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." You could almost hear the collective gasp from the crowd. Surpass the Pharisees? That seemed absolutely impossible. The Pharisees were the most outwardly righteous people anyone knew. They had memorized vast portions of Scripture, sometimes the entire Torah. They fasted twice every week, going without food as a spiritual discipline. They gave 10% of everything they owned, and when Jesus said everything, he meant everything. They even tithed their garden herbs, carefully counting out 1 leaf in 10 from their mint and dill plants. They washed their hands in elaborate purification ceremonies before meals. They kept thousands of detailed rules about the Sabbath, about ritual cleanness, about every aspect of daily life. They wore special clothing to show their devotion. Phylacteries containing scripture, verses on their foreheads and arms, tassels on their garments as the law commanded. They prayed long prayers in public. They studied scripture for hours every day. If anyone was righteous enough to get into heaven, surely it was them. They were the standard, the measuring stick, the example everyone else tried to imitate but could never match. But Jesus said his followers needed a righteousness that exceeded even theirs. How could that possibly be? How could ordinary fishermen and tax collectors surpass the experts who dedicated their entire lives to righteousness? The answer lay in everything Jesus had been teaching about the heart. The Pharisees focused completely on external behavior, while their hearts remained unchanged and corrupt. They looked righteous on the outside, impressively religious, but inside were full of pride, greed, and hardness toward others. They kept the letter of the law meticulously, while violating its spirit completely. They followed every detail about hand-washing, but ignored justice for the poor. They tithed garden herbs, but neglected mercy and faithfulness. They made long prayers in public, but devoured widows' houses. They used their righteousness to elevate themselves above others and looked down with contempt on common people who couldn't maintain their standards. Their righteousness was a performance, a show, a way to gain status and prove their superiority. The righteousness Jesus required went infinitely deeper. It started with the heart, being poor in spirit rather than proud, mourning over sin rather than denying it, being pure in heart rather than just clean in ritual. It wasn't about performing for others, but about genuine transformation from the inside out. It wasn't righteousness you achieved through your own effort and then maintained through careful rule-keeping. It was righteousness you received as a gift from God that then naturally flowed out in changed behavior. This righteousness exceeded the Pharisees not by doing more external things or following more rules. It exceeded them by being fundamentally different in nature, internal rather than external, received rather than achieved, heart level rather than surface level, humble rather than proud. Jesus then began demonstrating exactly what this deeper righteousness looked like by working through specific examples from the law. He started with the 6th commandment in Matthew 5:21-22. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Everyone in the crowd agreed that murder was wrong. The commandment was crystal clear: do not kill. If you murdered someone, you would face judgment, either from human courts or ultimately from God himself. The Pharisees could check this box easily. They hadn't murdered anyone. They weren't violent criminals. On this point, they were completely righteous, and so was everyone else who hadn't committed murder. But Jesus dug beneath the action to expose the root. Murder doesn't begin when a hand strikes or a weapon is raised. It begins much earlier, in the heart, with anger. Before a hand strikes in violence, the heart has already struck with hatred. Before a weapon is raised to kill, murderous anger has already taken root internally. The Pharisees congratulated themselves for not committing the external act of murder while harboring murderous anger, resentment, and hatred toward people they disliked. Jesus continued, again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Racha, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. These insults weren't just mean words. Raka was an Aramaic term of contempt meaning empty-headed, worthless. These expressions came from the same murderous spirit that could lead to actual killing. Then, in verses 23 through 26, Jesus emphasized the urgency of dealing with anger. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Reconciliation with your brother was more important than religious ritual. Deal with conflicts immediately, urgently, before they escalate. Jesus moved to the seventh commandment in Matthew 5:27-28. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Everyone agreed adultery was wrong. The Pharisees, who hadn't physically committed adultery, considered themselves righteous, but Jesus revealed that adultery begins in the heart. Looking at a woman with lustful intent was already committing adultery internally. The external act simply completed what started in the mind. This wasn't about noticing beauty. Jesus spoke of looking with the purpose of lusting, of feeding sexual desire, of fantasizing. The heart had already betrayed the covenant. Then in verses 29-30, Jesus said, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Was he literal? No, he was using dramatic imagery to make a point. Sin is serious. Lust isn't something to tolerate. Whatever leads you into sin, cut it off ruthlessly. Stop watching that. Stop going there. Stop dwelling on those thoughts. Deal with it drastically because the stakes are eternal. Topic 3. Radical Love and the Path to Perfection. 3.1. The Truth About Divorce, Protecting the Covenant. Jesus continued his teaching by addressing another area where the law had been misunderstood and misused. In Matthew 5:31-32, he said, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Divorce had become shockingly easy in that culture. Some religious teachers said a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason: if she burned his dinner, if he found someone more attractive, if she embarrassed him in public. All he had to do was write a certificate of divorce, hand it to her, and she was dismissed. The certificate was supposed to protect the woman by making the divorce official so she could remarry. But the system was being abused terribly. Men were using this as a way to trade in wives like property. Women had no rights in this process, no voice, no protection. They were completely vulnerable. A man could divorce his wife on a whim, leaving her with nothing, no home, no income, no way to support herself. In that society, a divorced woman had few options. Her reputation was damaged. Finding another husband was difficult. Many ended up destitute or forced into prostitution just to survive. Jesus cut through all the religious debates about proper grounds for divorce and went straight to the heart issue. God never intended marriage to be treated so casually. When a man divorced his wife for trivial reasons, he wasn't just ending a legal contract, he was breaking a sacred covenant, and he was forcing her into an impossible situation. If she remarried to survive, she would be committing adultery because the divorce wasn't legitimate in God's eyes. The man who divorced her carelessly was making her an adulteress by putting her in that position. Jesus said there was only one legitimate reason for divorce: sexual immorality, unfaithfulness that had already broken the marriage covenant. Short of that, divorce wasn't an option God approved. Marriage was meant to be permanent, a picture of God's faithful covenant with his people. Treating it as disposable violated everything it was supposed to represent. Jesus was protecting women from being discarded. But more than that, he was protecting the sacredness of the covenant itself. Jesus then moved to the matter of oath-taking in Matthew 5:33-37. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made." But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. In that culture, people made oaths constantly, swearing by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, by their own heads. They developed a complex system where some oaths were binding and others weren't. You could swear by the temple and break that oath, but if you swore by the gold of the temple, you had to keep it. You could swear by the altar and walk away, but swear by the gift on the altar and you were bound. Religious leaders had created all these categories and loopholes. The whole system revealed a deeper problem. People weren't trustworthy. They needed oaths because their normal word meant nothing. If someone just said yes or no, you couldn't believe them. But if they swore an oath, especially by something important, then maybe they were telling the truth. The culture had accepted that casual lying was normal, and oaths were the only way to know when someone was being honest. Jesus rejected this entire approach. He said, don't swear by anything, not by heaven, because that's God's throne, not by earth, because that's his footstool, not by Jerusalem, because that's his city, not even by your own head, because you don't have power to change even one hair's color. You don't control any of these things, so swearing by them is meaningless. More importantly, you shouldn't need oaths at all. Instead, Jesus said, let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Just tell the truth, simply and directly. If you say you'll do something, do it. If you say something is true, let it be true. If you make a promise, keep it. Your word alone should be completely reliable. You shouldn't need to swear oaths to make people believe you. The fact that oaths exist at all shows that evil has corrupted human speech. In God's kingdom, his people should be so consistently truthful that their simple word is trusted completely. Jesus then gave one of his most challenging and misunderstood teachings in Matthew 5:38-39. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. The eye for eye principle was actually meant to limit revenge, not encourage it. Before this law, if someone knocked out your tooth, you might kill their whole family in retaliation. The law said no, only equal payback, nothing more. One eye for one eye, one tooth for one tooth. It was meant to create fairness and stop cycles of escalating violence, but people had turned it into a justification for personal revenge. Someone wrongs you, you have the right to wrong them back equally. Someone hurts you, you're entitled to hurt them the same amount. It became a system where everyone kept score, where every injury demanded payback, where getting even was considered justice. Jesus completely overturned this thinking. He said, don't resist an evil person through retaliation. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn and offer them the other cheek too. Now, a slap on the right cheek was specific. It was a backhanded slap, an insult more than an attempt to injure. It was how a superior struck an inferior to humiliate them. A master might backhand a slave this way. A Roman might strike a Jew this way. It was about asserting dominance and showing contempt. Jesus said, when someone tries to humiliate you like this, don't retaliate with violence. Don't return insult for insult. Instead, turn your other cheek. This wasn't being a doormat or accepting abuse. It was refusing to play the game of retaliation. It was saying, "You can't control me with your contempt. I won't be pulled into the cycle of violence. I choose a different way." It took incredible strength and self-control. It required trusting God for justice instead of taking it into your own hands. Jesus continued with more examples in Matthew 5:40-41, saying, "And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles." The first example was about lawsuits. If someone took you to court demanding your shirt, your inner garment, Jesus said, "Give them your coat too." The coat was the outer garment, much more valuable, essential for warmth at night. Jewish law actually protected your coat. Even if someone took it as collateral for a debt, they had to return it by nightfall so you could sleep in it. It was considered necessary for survival. But Jesus said, if someone sues you for your shirt, give them both. Give more than they're demanding. This wasn't just about being nice. It was about breaking free from a mindset of minimal compliance and grudging obligation. It was choosing generosity, even when someone was treating you unfairly. Instead of fighting to keep what was yours, you gave freely. This completely disarmed the other person's aggression and revealed a heart that valued people over possessions. The second example was even more specific to their situation. Roman soldiers had the legal right to force civilians to carry their equipment for 1 mile. This was deeply resented. Imagine an occupying soldier stopping you, throwing his heavy pack on your back, and making you carry it while he walked unburdened. It was humiliating. It reminded everyone that they were conquered people without rights. People hated this law and complied only because they had to. Jesus said, when a soldier forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. After you've fulfilled the legal requirement, keep going. Choose to serve beyond what's demanded. This was revolutionary. The first mile was slavery. You had no choice. The second mile was freedom. You were choosing to serve. In that second mile, you transformed from a victim being used into a person making a free choice. You took back your dignity by choosing generosity. And you confused the soldier, who expected resentment but received willing service. Jesus reinforced this principle in Matthew 5:42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This extended the idea of radical generosity beyond specific situations to a general way of life. When someone asks you for something, give it. When someone wants to borrow from you, don't turn them away. This wasn't about being foolish or enabling destructive behavior. It was about having a generous heart that looked for ways to help rather than excuses to refuse. It was about being known as someone who gives rather than someone who hoards. In that culture, debt was crushing. People borrowed out of desperate need, not for convenience. If someone asked to borrow, they were probably facing hunger or homelessness. Most people in that situation couldn't pay back loans. Lending to them was essentially giving, because you'd likely never see that money again. That's why people usually refused. Why give to someone who can't repay? Why risk your own security to help someone else? Jesus was calling his followers to a completely different approach. See need and respond. Don't calculate whether you'll be repaid. Don't worry about being taken advantage of. Don't build walls to protect your resources. Instead, be generous. Be the person others know they can turn to when they're desperate. Let your default answer be yes instead of no. This required trust that God would provide for you as you provided for others. It required believing that generosity wouldn't leave you destitute, but would actually open the flow of God's blessing. This didn't mean having no wisdom or boundaries. Jesus wasn't saying to give money to someone you know will use it for destruction. But the heart attitude should always lean toward generosity. Always look for ways to help. Always err on the side of giving rather than withholding. Kingdom people should be marked by outrageous generosity that makes no sense to the world's way of thinking. Then Jesus gave the command that summarized everything he'd been teaching. In Matthew 5:43-44, he said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." The command to love your neighbor was straight from the law. But hate your enemy wasn't actually in Scripture. People had added that part themselves. It seemed logical. Of course you love your friends and neighbors. Of course you hate your enemies. That's just natural, just how the world works. Your enemies are trying to hurt you, so you should hate them back. It's us versus them. It's my people against your people. But Jesus said, love your enemies. Not tolerate them, not avoid them, not just refrain from killing them. Actually love them. This was absurd by worldly standards. Love the Romans who occupied your land. Love the tax collectors who stole from you. Love the people who persecuted you, lied about you, tried to destroy you. How was that even possible? Jesus wasn't talking about feelings. You can't force yourself to feel warm affection for someone who's hurting you. Love here meant choosing to seek their good, to treat them with kindness, to refuse to return evil for evil. It meant looking at your enemy and making a decision to love them anyway, regardless of how they treated you. It meant breaking the cycle of hatred that said you had to hate everyone who hated you. This was revolutionary. It meant you couldn't divide the world into good people who deserved love and bad people who deserved hatred. Everyone deserved love because everyone was made in God's image. Your enemy was someone God loved, someone Jesus would die for. If God loved them, who were you to hate them? Loving your enemies didn't mean approving of their evil actions. It meant refusing to let their evil turn you evil too. It meant staying human, staying compassionate, staying like Jesus, even when others became inhuman toward you. Jesus took this command even deeper in the rest of verse 44 and into verses 45 to 47. Pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Praying for your persecutors was the ultimate test of whether you truly grasped Jesus' teaching. Anyone could pray for their friends. That was easy, natural, required no spiritual maturity. But praying for the people actively hurting you, that required transformation at the deepest level. You couldn't fake that. You couldn't just go through the motions. To genuinely pray for someone's good when they were trying to destroy you meant your heart had been radically changed. Jesus explained why this mattered so much. When you love your enemies and pray for persecutors, you show yourself to be a true child of God. You're acting like your Father. God makes the sun rise on both evil people and good people. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. He doesn't withhold his blessings from people who reject him. He's kind to his enemies. He's generous to those who curse him. That's who God is, extravagantly loving even to those who don't deserve it. When you act the same way, you prove whose child you are. You demonstrate your family resemblance. But if you only love people who love you back, what's special about that? Jesus pointed out that even tax collectors, the most despised, traitorous people in Jewish society, loved people who loved them. Even pagans who didn't know God greeted their own people warmly. If you're only kind to your friends and family, you're not doing anything remarkable. You're just acting like everyone else in the fallen world. God's children should be different. They should love in a way that makes people stop and wonder. Their love should be so unusual, so inclusive, so persistent even in the face of hatred that it points to something beyond human nature. It should make people ask, how can you love like that? And the answer would be, because I've been loved like that by God. Jesus concluded this entire section with a statement that seemed impossible in Matthew 5:48. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Perfect? How could anyone be perfect? The command seemed designed to discourage rather than inspire. But Jesus wasn't setting an impossible standard just to make people feel bad. He was pointing to the goal, the target, the direction they should be moving. The word perfect here meant complete, mature, whole, reaching the purpose for which you were created. God is perfect in His love. He loves completely, without partiality, without limits. He loves His enemies. He's kind to people who rebel against Him. His love is the standard. Jesus was saying, this is what you're aiming for. This is the kind of people you're becoming. Move toward this. Grow into this. Let God transform you into this. It wasn't about achieving sinless perfection through your own effort. It was about letting God's perfect love fill you and flow through you until you loved like He loved. It was about becoming mature in love, complete in love, whole in love. Everything Jesus had taught in this sermon pointed toward this. The Beatitudes described the character of people being transformed. The commands about murder and adultery showed that God cares about the heart. The teachings about giving and praying and fasting revealed what it looks like when God's kingdom rules your life. And now, the commands about enemies and persecutors showed the full extent of kingdom love. It went beyond what seemed possible. It loved without limits. It gave without counting cost. It blessed those who cursed. It prayed for persecutors. This was the righteousness that exceeded the Pharisees. This was what it meant to be salt and light. This was the perfection God called His children toward. Not sinless perfection earned by effort, but loving perfection received as a gift and expressed through transformed lives. Be perfect as your Father is perfect. Love like He loves. Give like He gives. Forgive like He forgives. This was the standard, the goal, the vision of what His followers would become as His kingdom grew in their hearts. If this deep dive into Matthew 5 has opened your eyes to something new, if you've seen Jesus' teaching in a fresh light, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our biblical explorations. And please, share this video with someone who needs to hear these truths. Someone in your life is searching for meaning, for purpose, for a way to live that actually makes sense. This message could be exactly what they need. Let's spread these timeless truths together. Subscribe, share, and let's keep studying God's Word. See you in the next video.